Hey guys, what's going on? So in today's video, what I want to do is I want to walk you through how to build a Django REST API using the Django REST API framework and linking that to a machine learning model. So if you remember last week, we built this machine learning model, or the week prior, sorry. And this machine learning model basically tells you whether or not somebody's going to be approved or denied for a loan based on certain information about them. And one of the questions is, well, how do you productionize something like this? And what I talked about last week when I built that pickle module, and if you haven't seen that, look above, is you want a customer to be able to go in and fill out a form, and it should tell you whether or not you're rejected or approved based on a machine learning model running in the background. The form itself is something I'm going to build later on, but what I have done is I've built the API already. So the API is ready to go, and I'm going to show you how it works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up Postman, and for those of you who don't know what Postman is a really cool API testing tool. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to visit some kind of an endpoint. So in this case, I've defined status, and I'll go over the code right after this. And I'm sending it a JSON file essentially. Now, if you look at this file, it's already one-hot encoded. If you want to just go ahead and send a non-one-hot encoded file, it's an easy modification to the code, which I will be doing in some of the future videos anyways, but just to make sure this worked, I wanted to sort of do this. And what it's supposed to do is, based on certain criteria, when you actually send this to the API, it's going to tell you down here whether or not that person is approved or rejected. And so in this case, you say that that person is actually approved. But I can go ahead and change some of these criteria around. So this person has 3 dependents, their monthly income is $4,500, their co-applicant's monthly income is $1,500. They're looking for $128,000 in loan, 360-month term. So when you look at all these different things, the machine learning model is going to go back in history and it's going to say, let me go and see how others were evaluated in the past, whether or not they were defaulted on their loan or not, and all that other great stuff. And then it's going to tell you, okay, you know what, you're approved or you're not. So, I mean, if we did something funny here, like, let's say we said this is going to be 1.28 million and you sent this to the API, I'm hoping it's going to say rejected. So we'll see down here in a second. And so now you see that it says rejected. And so you can play around with a lot of these different criteria. You can give them more money if you want. I can go ahead and change their credit rating. So if I change your credit history, so if I run this the way it is, let's just see what it does. And this is back to what it was before. But if I change their credit history, for example, to 0, which indicates that they have a pretty bad credit history, this is going to say rejected here, hopefully again as well. And like I said, you can play around with different characteristics here. And, this is a great way to start evaluating whether or not somebody is a good candidate for a loan. And, the whole idea is in Django to go ahead and build a profile of this person. And as you build that profile, you're going to see whether or not they're going to be a candidate. And the great thing about this is you can pretty much put this on top of any kind of machine learning model out there. So as you see, I'm just playing around with some of this stuff to see whether or not they still qualify. But, the weights of the machine learning model will tell you whether or not they qualify or not. So let me go ahead and quickly show you the architecture of this. It's a very straightforward architecture, and then we'll get into the code. All right, so there's not anything that's super fancy that's happening around here, but essentially what happens is on the client side, so if you're going to do an API call, that could be with a browser, you could have some kind of a Python script or whatever other script that you have in any language. The good thing about JSON is it's very agnostic to the type of language you use. It's almost like a universal way of sending data. But from the client side, you're going to go ahead and make a request. That could be, like I said, through your browser. Could be using a form. It could be like what I did using Postman, using a JSON request. So you're going to make something called a post request, and that is basically you're sending information to the server. When this information gets to the server, the Django REST framework kicks in, at which point it's going to do a few things. It's going to take the data that you sent, it's going to do something called serialize it, and what that allows Django to do is convert it into a JSON format. Because like I said, JSON is very much readable by different languages. So it's going to take all the model objects, and we're going to cover model objects a little bit later on, but essentially that's going to be all the different fields that you're looking for. So it could be your dependents, your name, your income, and all that other kind of stuff. We're going to create something called a model, and in that we're going to have all the objects in there, which we'll walk through later on. Then the actual machine learning script is going to go ahead and take that information, it's going to convert it into a dictionary, and then we're going to go ahead and retrieve all the different weights in the pickle file that we have. So in the pickle file, we have 2 different types of weight. One is we have the weights for the neural network, and the second is we have the scalars for scaling the data so that it's comparable. Finally, it's going to do all those calculations in the machine model script Once it's come out with an answer, it's going to go ahead and send a JSON response back to the client, in which case you're going to see accepted or rejected. So that's basically the architecture. All right, so now what I want to do is let's go over the code. And to start, I'm going to very quickly set up a virtual environment where we're going to install all the dependencies that we're going to need for the REST API. And if you're curious on how to set up Django in a little bit more detail, I'm going to link above how I set up Django on a Raspberry Pi, which you can go and check out. Setting it on a Mac or Windows-based computer is pretty much going to be the same, with the exception of a few commands with Windows. But anyways, let's go ahead and create our virtual environment first. So I'm going to go virtual env. I'll call it VNV, and then I'll specify that I want to use Python 3. So you'll see here that it's actually saying it's installing the setup tools, pip and wheel. Great. So now I have my virtual environment set up. So what we're going to do is we see that it's called VENV. So I'm going to go ahead and activate that. To do that, you type in source, VENV, bin activate. And so now that I have the VENV in front here, you know that I'm actually in my virtual environment, which is what I want. If I were to do a quick pip freeze, you'll see that I have nothing installed at this point, and that's what we want. We want to start up with a fresh environment. Just making this a little bit bigger so that we can see it. There we go. So first things first, I want to go ahead and install Django. So pip install Django. And what it's going to do is it's going to pull the latest version of Django, which according to this is 2.2.4. And so Django's done. So if I go ahead and run that pip freeze again, you're going to see that it's actually installed Django 2.2.4 and a few other dependencies that Django's going to need as well. So the other thing we need to install is we need to go install the Django REST framework. So to do that, we're going to go pip install Django REST framework. And so it's going to install the dependencies for that. Do another quick pip freeze, and you'll see Django REST framework is version 3.10.2. So if you want to follow along with this tutorial, try to go ahead and install Django 2.2.4 and then this REST framework version as well. I'm not sure as the versions change whether or not things are going to change here, but I'd recommend you install these versions. Otherwise, we will look at how to update this stuff in the future if we need to as well. So let me go ahead and clear the screen out, and we're in our virtual environment. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and create an app. Like I said, I'm going to be flying through this fairly quick. And sorry, I meant create a project first, and then we'll create an app after. So I'm going to basically go ahead and hit the same command again, Django admin, start app. We'll call the app Django API tutorial, or just call it Django API. And so now my app should be created. And if I want to validate whether it is actually created or not, I would just do ls, and you see there's going to be a folder for Django API. So let's go ahead and go into that folder. So now I have my actual project folder, and then I have manage.py. Now the next thing I want to be able to do is I want to be able to create a super user so that I can log into this stuff. And before I create a super user, I have to run something called migrations, and that is let my database know what I've already done so far. So to do that, we're going to hit Python manage.py migrate. And again, if I'm going a little too fast, check out my tutorial on setting this up on a Raspberry Pi. I go through all of this in a little bit more detail so that it's going to be easier to understand. So now that I've done that, I can go ahead and create my super user. So I'm going to say manage.py create super user. It's going to say, well, do I want to leave this as my username? Nope. I'm just going to change the stats to make it easy. Don't need to add an email address. And I will go ahead and enter in a generic password for now. And so my super user has now been created. And so now if I go ahead and deploy this, and I go python manage.py and I hit run server, it's going to give me a little URL that I can go ahead and visit. So let's go to this URL. So let's go ahead and open up a browser. We'll go to this URL, and I'm going to make this fit my screen just because I'm recording in a different resolution. So here we go. And you'll see that Django has been installed, which is great. And if I go to the admin panel, just hit /admin, I'm now able to log in with my username and password that I put in. And right now you just see there's basic authentication for groups and user setup here. I have no application or anything like that here. So down here, as we create this application for the API, you're going to see a little box similar to this appear just below with the information that's going to be relevant to us for our API. So So the next thing we got to do is we got to go ahead and start or create an app, excuse me. So I'm just going to get out of this, clear it, and we're going to go ahead and hit, and I just like to use the up key because it's just easier to not type all the time. So we'll say Django start project and we'll call it my API or something like that. And so what you'll see here is you'll see there's a folder for my API. Now at this point you can continue to develop in Terminal, but really I like using, whenever I'm developing in Django, for some reason I just find Sublime Text to be so much easier to use. And so I'll just go to project, add folder project. We'll find this somewhere here, and then I'll add in this Django API. And so what you'll see here is you'll see that I've got my Django API project name, and then my API is going to be the actual API that we're going to be using. All right, so right off the bat, there's something we got to do, and that is the first thing we got to go into the settings file. We're going to have to go ahead and update the apps. So we're going to update the installed apps because we need to tell Django to read these. So first and foremost is REST framework, and this is what we had installed as one of those dependencies. And then the second one we're going to add in is the actual API we created, which is my API. So we'll say my API. Another tip for you guys, don't ever expose your secret key. I'm going to trash this project after this anyway, so it doesn't matter to me. But this is something, especially when you go into production, you want to hide. So we'll walk through how to do that eventually at some point. So anyways, I've gone ahead and I've installed the apps. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to show up on my website yet, because there's a few other things we have to do. Map the URLs, and we're also going to have to go ahead and serialize this stuff and a whole bunch of other fun stuff that's going to happen. Now the other thing that I like doing right off the bat is you'll notice that there's something called urls.py. Now urls.py right now is sitting in the main project folder, but realistically speaking you're going to need a urls.py in your API folder as well, because I'll explain to you in 1 second why that's important, but let me just go ahead and do this before I forget. So I'll go into coding, go into Django tutorial, Django API, and we basically need it here. And so I will paste it right there. And you'll notice that it just kind of showed up right there. Now the reason why you're going to need this, and I'm going to edit the one that's in the application right now, we're not going to need a whole bunch of this stuff. So get rid of this, and then we'll just comment this out for now. And so the reason why this is so important is when I go ahead and map my URL, so as you saw, I went to /admin, it took me to the admin URL, the admin backend essentially. If I go ahead and I say, I map something like /pull API or my API, I want to go ahead and tell it to use all the URLs that are listed under the API. So the main page, so if I were to just draw something here, this is your main URL that people are going to go to. And so this could be something like, I'm completely making this up. I don't own me.com. I wish I did, but I don't. Or something like that. And then you're going to have some kind of a /. And let's say I want to go to the API. So I want to say, visit the API page or something like that. Well, the main page is going to say, okay, here's the API link. I'm going to forward you now to the API application. So now this is that my application, that my API that we created. And what this is now going to do is this is going to have a whole bunch of its own URLs. So you may want to pull something like, first names or last names, depending on how you set up your endpoint. And so what you want to do is something like me.com /API, and then all the different APIs that are going to be under here are going to come right after this. And so what you're essentially saying is open up the API application, and then after that, all the URLs thereafter map to whatever this application tells me that it wants it to do. All right, so now we've done that. I want to go ahead and add a path here. And the path I'm going to add here is just going to be /API. And then right now I don't have anything here, but what I will do is I'll say my API, which has yet to be created yet, but that's essentially where it's going to be. So it's going to be under the my API URL or application name, and then site, and then the URLs that are going to go under that. So we'll create that later. Like we created the py file, but there's no mapping here. But in here now we told it to make sure that it goes to whatever is pointing in this here. All right, cool. So the next thing we want to do now is I want to go ahead and create my models. So what are models? So models are in Django classified as what I want, for a lack of better terms, what do I want my form to look like? What kind of data elements do I want to start capturing or pushing or doing whatever with it? And so the simplest way to think about a form is if I go ahead and look at that Excel spreadsheet that we were working with in the last tutorial. So if I just bring that up, what you'll see in that Excel spreadsheet is you'll see there's a whole bunch of different information that it would ask you. It would ask you if you had any dependents, what your income was, what your co-applicant's income was, the loan amount, and all that kind of stuff. And so I want to be able to go ahead and collect this information. This is the information that I want to know. And so as I do this, there's a couple of different things that I want to go ahead and capture. And depending on how I set up my models, this may or may not be that hard to get, actually. So let's start with, it doesn't have my first name or last name. I probably should add in some kind of a name element, but I'm not going to because we didn't feed it into the machine learning model. But let's assume that, that's one of the elements we're going to go ahead and capture. So I will put it in here anyways. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define a class. And in that class, we're going to say whether or not, let's call it approvals. And this is, I want to know whether or not they got approved for the loan. And if you use Django, you'll notice that I'm going to be inheriting something called model from this method called models in the Django DB. And that essentially helps me understand things like setting up things like char fields or integers and all that other kind of fun stuff. So let's go ahead and say first name is equal to models dot, and so I believe it's called char field. And you can also set up a max length as well, which is probably a good idea to do. I can't remember if this is true or not, but I think in the docs it actually said that you should consider it. We'll say max length 15 or something like that. And then I'll do the same thing for last name. So I'll say last name is equal to this. And now we'll start collecting the data elements that are really going to drive this machine learning model. So do you have any dependents? So we'll say dependents is equal to, and then we'll say we'll say this is an integer field. So integer field, and we're probably going to have a lot of either char or car, however you want to say that, char fields and integer fields. We'll say the income, so we'll say applicant. And so this is going to be a big model, actually, now that I think about it. Applicant. And so that's what your model is going to look like. Now there's one other thing you want to do, and that is when you actually go ahead and render this, or render this under your under the application, what you don't want to do is have random text show up. So you want to return a self method, and this just basically says that, return one of these characteristics above here, and we'll just say return equals self dot, and we'll say first name and self dot last name or something like that, or just stick to first name actually. And that's it. So you set up your models.py. So let's quickly look at the documentation actually now that we're here. So let's go here. So Stack Overflow says that there's documentation for it. It's called field choice, it sounds like. So let's go to the docs and see what they say. And so you can. So there's something called field choice. And to set this up, you would do something like this. Okay, that's not too bad. So we can certainly set that up. So let me set that up, and I'm going to get back to you guys in 1 second. I'll show you what the output looks like. All right, that was really long. So anyways, I think this is how it works. I checked out the documentation, and what you got to do is you got to go ahead and in your class, in this case we're going to call it approvals, you would go ahead and define your different choices. So my gender choices are, this is what we'll return, and this is what's going to show in the actual dropdown. So I just mirrored everything because that's what I wanted to do. And then once you do that, you're going to go ahead and say, we're okay to actually leave this as a char field, but then you're going to define the choices for this to be equal to gender choices. And so for this case, for gender, our choices are male and female. And for example, our choice for area or property is going to be the property choices, which are rural, semi-urban, and urban. So we're going to go ahead and run this. And I'm hoping this is working. I actually didn't test this yet. So we're going to do run server. It didn't give me an error, which is nice to see. And there's one critical thing I actually forgot, and that is anytime you change your models, you need to make sure that you also run your migrations. So let's go to the admin panel. See if things showed up. So there's approvals. When I click on add, it gives me the first name, last name. So remember, I defaulted everything to 0 just to make it simple because it's an integer. I didn't really know what else to do, or I could have left it blank, I guess. And look at here, it actually has all of our different drop downs that we put down in there. So we know that that piece worked. So if I go back, so we can add a person's profile in here somewhere. Now this is in the admin panel, but remember I want the user to be able to add this in. We'll get to that later. And what if this is probably because I didn't make migrations. Let me just see if I made, but I'd have to close this. All right, so I'm gonna try making migrations. So let's get out of this. All right, so it said that there's a migration available for the approvals model. So we're gonna say this, and then we're just gonna say migrate. All right, let's see what it does now. So it's done this. If I go back and run server, let's see what happens. All right, so now it works. Cool. Because now it wasn't reading to the database. So right now I have 0 candidates in there. I can probably go ahead and add somebody. I want to be able to add people's profiles. Let's say I'm a banker. And then I want to be able to query people's profiles. And then I also want to call the API, which is the actual machine learning model, to see whether or not they're approved or not. So we're going to build that piece by piece. But I want to show you along the way as I'm actually building this. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to probably start building some views. But before I go into views, there's actually something else I forgot to show you, and that is the admin. And so in order for this to show up down here, you have to go ahead and register your model. And in order to register your model, what you're going to do is you're going to import from the models class. You're going to import your specific method, which is approvals in this case, which is right here, approvals. And then after you've imported it, you have to register it to the admin site. So we're going to say admin.site.register approvals. Once you do this and run it, then this little applet shows here, and it looks like everything is working the way it should. I can add, we haven't added anything yet because I want to use the API to do that, but let's keep building forward now. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at is I just created a file here called serializers.py. And if you go ahead and read some of the documentation for the Django REST framework, it is actually going to tell you that you need to create something called a serializer. Now what a serializer does essentially is it will be the mechanism that is going to handle your requests and convert it in the background into a JSON file. And so when you do an HTTPS request, you'll generally get the response back here, for example, as a JSON. So you'll make it something like, ID is equal to 1, and maybe you'll get first name is equal to Mark, last name, whatever, and then that'll get closed off, comma, and then your next field comes. And that's basically typical of how you would get a JSON format. So there's a few different types of serializers that Django has. I typically use one that is called a model serializer. It's around here somewhere, but we'll have to find it. But again, there's a lot of examples in the docs in terms of how you would go ahead and create this. So we're just going to create a very simple serializer, and I'll show you how to do that right now. But anyways, you should go through the docs. There's a whole bunch of different topics on how you create serializers, what they are, and how they work, and so forth. So if I had to just create one from scratch, first things first, we need to import a few things. We're going to say from REST_framework import serializers, and then we're going to say from REST_framework, we're also going to import our model name. So our model name, or class, sorry, in our API was called, I believe it's called approvals. All right, so we have that. And so next we're going to go ahead and create a class. And in this class we're going to have, generally when you keep when you're creating a serializer, you want to just keep your model name and then add serializer at the end. And I think the documentation, whether this is convention or not, I typically just follow the docs. So approvals is my model, and then serializers right after with a capital S. And then we're going to go ahead and import serializers and the one, like I said, that I use is called model serializers. There's a few others that allow some more customization. Model serializers really doesn't. It's what I would say is it's pretty cookie cutter in terms of how it's going to go ahead and take a look at your fields and return them. And for a beginner, I would say this is probably the way to go. The next thing it's going to ask you to do is it's going to ask you to build a class for the metadata. So meta, we would say something like model, And so our model name is actually equal to approvals. We know that. And then what you would need to do down here is you would need to go and define the fields that you want to show. Now there's a few ways you can do this. You can go ahead and, when we go back to our models, there's all these fields. First name, last name, dependent. There's a whole bunch of fields, and I actually want to see all of them. So you can do one of two things. You can literally go and type the fields that you want, first name, and then last name, and so forth. And this is what's going to show up in the JSON file. So you're going to have an ID, for example. It's going to say ID1, first name Jack, last name Smith, and then all the other fields are going to populate right below that. But there's an easier way to do it, and in our scenario, I just want to get everything. So you would do, they call it underscore or double underscore all, and I believe this needs to be in single quotes, and that's it. And so now you've built your serializer, and it's actually going to return all the different values in here, and that's what we want it to do. All right, so next up is probably the most interesting file, and that is my views file. So in my views file, this is where I'm going to be putting the majority of my code. It's going to be housing most of the algorithm in the background. Now there's a lot of dependencies you see here. Some are just default from Django, some I had to add. And the reason is I had to split this up because what I have in here is I have my view set model in here anyways, which I'll explain in just a quick second. And then I'm also testing out that form I was talking about before. I'm not going to demo this in this video, that'll be for the next video. And then finally, I've got my machine learning model here. Now, to really cut down on this code, I could have just imported this model altogether from a different Python file, but I just chose to leave it in here for now, but I will clean this up later on. But again, you can cut down on a lot of these if you wanted to. So let's walk through this. So first things first, what the views model is doing is I'm starting off a new class calling viewSets.modelViews. And basically in this, what I'm saying is anytime I call the request, get all the objects in there. So anything that's sitting in my approvals class under my models, so anything that's in my models, I want you to grab everything that is currently available. And then the serializer I want to use for that is approval serializers. So for example, I have another endpoint set here, which is called /API. And let's just go to that for a second, and I'll tell you what I'm talking about. So when I go to status, that's what I was pinging through my Postman here. But if I actually go to /API, what it's going to do for me is it's going to go ahead and give me this link to go ahead and pull everything. And when I said go ahead and select all the different objects in here, which is this line over here, what it's going to do, it's actually going to pull every single record in there. So this would be the equivalent of my get request. And what I'm saying is when you go ahead and pull this, get everything that's there. And then finally, the serializer class that we want to use is the approval serializers that we created. All right, so I'm going to skip over this piece here, and now I'm going to go directly into this. This is called a decorator, and what I've done is I've imported this decorator to basically handle my post requests. Rather than me coding out how I want the post to be handled, this is going to handle it for me, and it just makes life a little bit easier. There's also API handling at the class level, but we're doing this pretty much at the function level here. So I've defined this new function called approve_reject, and in here I'm going to be passing through the request. I'm going to also import my model, which is for my machine learning model, using my pickle module. And so now that I have the model, I'm going to go ahead and request the data. And when you do something like request.data, this is actually going to go ahead and return a dictionary for you. And then what you do is you pull the values only of the dictionary, because I'm not too concerned with the keys. The values are what's going to go inside my machine learning model. And you convert that to an NP array, or NumPy array in this case. I want to make sure I go ahead and reshape this. Then I also want to go ahead and bring in my scaler that I used when I scaled my original model. I want to transform this function or this variable that I just called unit, which is a representation of the JSON file that I pushed through, converted into just using the values for it. After I've scaled that, then I'm going to go ahead and predict it. I'm going to use the same threshold that I use in my original model. And then I'm going to go ahead and present that back into a data frame. Now my data frame is going to give me basically true or false. And so what I say here is anytime there's a true, treat that as approved. Anytime there's a false, treat that as rejected. And then this is going to return back a JSON response back to me saying your status is, and then it's going to return back whatever this is going to be, whether it's true or false. So you'll see here, down here it says your status is, and then it's returning back true or false. And so that's really how my views is set up. Could I have made this simpler? Yes, and I probably will. But for demonstration purposes, I think this is a good way to represent it for now. All right, so after that is done, now we are going to go to the URLs file. And I've added a couple of different endpoints here. So the form one is something that I'm going to show you guys the next time around, and that is where users are able to go ahead and input a form. The status you've already seen, which is I set this path up status / and this is where we would go ahead and look at our endpoint to get this information regarding whether or not you're going to be used or not. So essentially my status in this case is set up to be where my machine learning model is sitting. So passing the data there, retrieving back approved or rejected. And / API is just going to be the interface that I've been using for these requests. So I can go ahead back to my API route. So remember, this is / API. If I hit this link, then I have all these different options where I can do get, post, and all that other kind of fun stuff. And so that is basically how URLs Pi is set up for now at the application level. Now we're going to talk about the main page. All right, so now that we've looked at the URLs.py under the application, now I'm going to go ahead and look at the main page. So what I've got is, we've got our admin panel that we can go to. I've purposely left the routing to the application level URLs blank. And so what that allows me to do is I can just type in the URL / and then I can go ahead and put in form API and status. So if let's say for example, went here and I change this to, let's go and change this to something like test /. What that's going to now allow me to do is I can go ahead and go / test / API. And now this takes me to the API page. Before, I was able to just get there without test. So now let's go ahead and remove test. And I'll show you that when I refresh, this page isn't going to work. But if I take out test, I can go ahead and do this. Now this makes sense to do if I have one application. If you have multiple applications, you probably want to put the application name or something representing that application first, and then any endpoints thereafter for that. But that is essentially how my main file is now set up. So I've got my admin, I've left this blank. If I have multiple applications, I will probably add something here. And then after that, basically it takes over and it follows this URL convention over here. All right, and so that is pretty much all the code we're going to need, or we needed, to do all of this work. So I know we went through so many different files and we were bouncing around everywhere with all these different files, but let's just go back and recap one more time. When a user comes in, they have the option to either go to admin, or at this current point in time, they're going to be routed to one of the URL endpoints that are part of the application URLs, URIs, URLs. So they have the option to do form, which is going to happen later. API if they just want to see the information using a GET request. And then finally status if they want to interact with the machine learning model, and it's going to give them the status of whether or not they're rejected or not. If they follow the status path, we're going to go to the views file. As they go to / status, what I've basically said in that case is we're going to go to views and we're going to go to approve reject. And so once they go to / status, it's going to take them to this view, which is approve reject. They're going to take whatever information they put in. In this case, we put in information in a JSON file here. We're going to take all of that information, finally. We're going to pass it through. We're going to pre-process that data a little bit, get the values out of it, reshape it, put it into the machine learning model, scale that information, and finally make a prediction against it. And then we're going to send a response back to the user as to whether or not they were actually rejected or they were approved, which you see over here. And so that is essentially in a nutshell how this API works. The information that we're collecting from them is all going to be based on models. Remember, when we're getting that JSON information, we have to serialize it and we have to convert it into the JSON so that our Python code can actually understand it. So although it sounds complicated and as you run through it, it becomes a little bit easier, I would say that when you're going to use something like Django, it's definitely not for beginners. If you're a beginner, you'd probably have to watch this over and over again. I've used Django before. The REST framework is a little bit new to me, which is probably why you saw me go back and forth and look at some of the docs. But at the end of the day, hey, we got it to work, and that's the most important thing. And so in reality, you'd probably want to render this on some kind of an HTML file that has some CSS built in and, it looks presentable, not in a way like this. But for testing purposes, we know that the code works, and that's the most important thing. So you know, like I said, if this was a bit confusing, go ahead and watch this back a couple of times because it's going to help you get the concept. Also, you should also look at trying to just pick up Django in general, right? Learning different frameworks within Django. You know, how it works with Bootstrap, how it works with CSS, how it works with HTML, Jinja, all that other kind of fun stuff. So, you know, this was a great tutorial, even for me, to be honest with you, to go ahead and build this in Django, because I've typically built something like this in Flask in the past. But, you know, like I said, we got it to work. So thumbs up if you like this, and comment and subscribe, and I'll talk to you next time. Thanks. Bye.